Okay, right, I think we're live. Hello and welcome. My name's Jenny Florence, and we are now live. I've just recognised we are now live. Okay, fantastic. Right, I'm Jenny Florence. I'm the author and creator of the A to Z of Emotional Health online audio library, or in fact now video library as well. Today I'm going to be talking about self-esteem. We decided we would hold this event today because it is a free live streaming event in support of Mental Health Awareness Week. So we will be talking about self-esteem. We're going to talk about how to build self-esteem, what goes wrong, why some people have good self-esteem and other people don't. We'll be taking questions. And most importantly, we are going to spend a fair bit of time really talking about what you can do if you have low self-esteem with real pragmatic and practical tools, tips, advice as to how you can approach this. Because self-esteem, if your self-esteem is low, it really is a massive, massive problem, and it can really, really underpin all kinds of problems and difficulties in your daily life. So that is the subject for us today. With me here is my dear friend and colleague, Libby Alderson.
Hello.
Brilliant.
I'm Libby Alderson, and I'm joining Jenny today. Largely, I work within business and commerce as a coach and in the area of people development.
Thanks, Lib. Right. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. We will be actually using a chat facility, which in fact I now need to make sure I put on. There we go. Brilliant. It's up and running. So we now have a live chat facility. So if you wish to ask questions, you can do so using this live facility. However, some of the feedback we had from a couple of people after we did the pilot episode, Lib, was that some people, if they are feeling particularly vulnerable, don't necessarily want to actually use this facility because obviously because we are on YouTube as a live facility, it will show who you are. So what we have done is that we have now a dedicated number that will be available for the entire event. You can't call the number, we're not taking live calls, but you can text. And if you text your questions, we will do our best to answer them. Again, we're not going to be able to answer everyone, but we will do our utmost to be as responsive as we can. And also we will pause from time to time and just ask if there's anything you wish to say at that point. I'm also aware there's a kind of a slight delay on this as a live streaming event. So we will pause and just give you a few minutes to ask questions to respond if you wish. Now, that dedicated number is 07 874 196 598. I'll just repeat that. It's 07 874 196 598. So as I said, do please text in any questions at any time. Lib's got the phone in hand and we'll be checking on a regular basis.
Just to say, Jenny, as well, there's no cost to contacting that phone.
Absolutely, yes. There is no cost whatsoever. Well, beyond the fact that it will be your standard text charge. We don't cover the cost of that, but it will be no different to texting anyone else. So it would just be part of your normal call package. There's no extra costs in terms of texting it. Also to say, if you have actually missed this event or you would like to pass it on for someone else to listen to, if you think there's some useful and helpful stuff in it, the event is being recorded. And so after today, it will go live onto YouTube. It will also be in the A to Z of Emotional Health library. So it is available for free replay at any time. The other thing I wanted to just say as well is that any links or references that I make during the event, I will actually list them and send them out via email afterwards. So for anyone that's registered with us, you will automatically get an email sometime after the event, usually within 24 hours, with any links, any quotes, so that you can actually access that information more thoroughly. If you are not, if you're watching this now and you're not actually registered with us and you want to be registered, that also means we can let you know about future events. You can join my email list, and that's on jennyflorencehealth.com. That's jennyflorencehealth.com. And when the new A to Z library goes live, there will also be a facility there to join up. And we don't share your information with anyone. We use it solely to inform you about things that are going on. And the other thing is that the A to Z of emotional health also has its own Facebook page. And I will also put the links on there. I think that's useful. Again, if you just want to access the information, it will be available there. All right, so I think that's probably my first page of housekeeping done. Okay, so self-esteem. What is it? Now, self-esteem is very much, it's a very personal thing. It's an internal experience of how we value ourselves. We found a lovely quote earlier by somebody called Amity Gage. And they say, I think, is Amity Gage a he or a she?
I presume a lady.
I presume too, but I was unsure. So Amity Gage, I apologize. But anyway, she says, to me, self-esteem is not self-love. It is self-acknowledgement, as in recognizing and accepting who you are. I think that's a brilliant quote to start with, because people often confuse self-esteem and confidence. Self-esteem is literally the way we feel about ourselves. It's not about confidence at all. Some people can have very, very high levels of confidence and actually feel completely rubbish about themselves. Their self-esteem can be really, really low. If you want to really go into the difference between confidence and self-esteem in any depth, I do have, I think it's about a 20-minute audio about this subject, and it is available in the A to Z library, and it's now available on YouTube, so on the A to Z channel. So by all means, check that out. But I think if you think about the word self-esteem, for starters, you have to have a sense of self to have self-esteem. You have to have some sense of being someone, of an entitlement of being a human being and being a valid human being in your own right. And if I think about the people in my world that I hold in high esteem, I hold them in high regard. Self-esteem is about holding myself in high esteem. It means I value myself. I hold myself in high regard. It means that I'm going to be thoughtful and considerate and responsive to myself. Very much about an internal self-value, as opposed to an ability to feel, I don't know, confidence is very much an external affair. So we don't actually have to be confident about everything that we do in life. We need to be confident about the things that we need to tackle. I mean, a good example I always use is, I will never ever be confident about doing a bungee jump. I can honestly tell you this, okay? Because the honest truth is, nor do I need to be, because I'm never ever going to do one. But you know, it doesn't matter. So I don't need to be confident about everything. I wasn't confident about public speaking, but I decided to go and do a course about it. So again, I don't need, if I wasn't going to do any public speaking, that wouldn't be necessary. So it wouldn't actually matter to me. So we don't have to be confident about everything. But self-esteem is really important, because it actually undermines, if we have low self-esteem, it undermines our capacity to develop our confidence. So, for example, when I went and did my public speaking course, my confidence was low in public speaking, but my self-esteem is good. So I could go to something and have a go at it. And even if it hadn't worked out for me, I wouldn't have slaughtered myself or criticized myself for it. I could go with an open mind. I could go as an open book, available to the experience and available to learn. And that enabled me to then develop my confidence in that particular area. Whereas if my self-esteem was really low, it may well have stopped me from even having a go in the first place. And interestingly enough, people with low self-esteem, even when they do have a go at something, they very rarely celebrate their achievements. Would you
Yeah,
agree with that?
frequently I would say that when working with people to help them learn, that's one of the things you have to address initially is someone's self-esteem, because that can be a
Mm,
barrier to
yeah.
allowing themselves to be in that place where obviously they don't know everything about the subject at this time, but that will come.
Mm,
So
yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Mm,
So self-esteem is, in my opinion, far more
mm,
important than confidence. So confidence is something we can learn depending on what we need and where we need it. Self-esteem will impact on our ability to develop confidence and to sustain
yes.
confidence. I mean, it really does have an impact on
Mm,
sustaining our everyday sense of well-being in all
mm,
areas of our lives. Now, actually, Lib, I wrote a list of the kind of
okay.
um, the common sort of, I don't know, the common things that people who have low self-esteem demonstrate.
Yes.
So I'm just going to run through that list because I think it's probably quite a useful time to do it. So people who have low self-esteem are often full of self-doubt. So they really, really doubt their capacity to do
Mm,
anything very well. They worry a lot about everything. So there's a lot of
mm,
anticipation ahead of time. I mean, we all anticipate things ahead of time, but when they anticipate ahead of time, they tend to anticipate things going wrong rather than things
yes.
going well. You know, there's a lot of worry
Mm,
involved. They worry a huge amount about what other people think about them. So that's a real challenge. People with low self-esteem are usually highly sensitive, actually. Now, I'm what I'm going to say now
mm,
is, and I mean this with no disrespect to anyone who isn't very sensitive or to anyone that is,
mm,
because I think our sensitivity to
mm,
things varies. We're all on the scale somewhere, and I think we have gifts in different areas of our lives.
yes.
You know, in some ways, people who are less sensitive often manage life in a more sort of steady way.
Mm,
They're not affected by things in the same way. People who are very sensitive are highly affected by
yes.
everything that's going on around them, particularly other people. And that's another reason why highly sensitive people will often have low self-esteem, because they become acutely aware of the people around them and they worry about people's responses. They worry about getting it right for others. So people with, as I said, low self-esteem, they often then develop. It's quite fascinating because
Mm,
people with low self-esteem develop very good people skills. They often become people
yes.
pleasers. But one of the challenges that I think we face if we have low self-esteem is working out how to use those people skills in ways that kind of still allow us to flourish. Because if we become a people pleaser
Mm,
at the expense of ourselves, then ultimately we can quite seriously head into burnout on
mm,
occasions. We're looking after everybody
mm,
else, but we don't look after us. I sometimes use the analogy of a glass of water or a jug of water. If you're filling up everybody else's cups all the time, but you never stop and replenish your own, ultimately you're going to run out. And then you're no good to anyone, not to yourself or anyone else. So this is really common with people with low self-esteem, how they relate to others. As I said, very often at the expense of themselves, very affected by the people they come into contact
mm,
with. As I said, highly sensitive. Well, this is another lovely word that I like using. It's not just about sensitivity, it's about being absorbent, okay? And there is a difference because we can be very sensitive and very empathic. People with low self-esteem are what I would consider to be very absorbent. So if they walked into a room, let's say we've
yes.
just had a blazing row, Lib, which is
Okay. I
highly
can
unlikely,
try
but
and
let's
imagine.
we'll try and
Yes.
imagine that because we're actually very good at communicating with one another.
Mm,
We great
mm,
conversations between us. But let's say we've had a blazing
yes.
row, Lib, and somebody with low self-esteem, if they walked into the
Mm,
room, they may well start to wonder, they'd feel the atmosphere.
okay.
And instead of thinking, whoa, what's gone on with Jenny and Lib, and checking it out with us,
Yes.
they are far more likely to click into self doubt mode and think, whoa, what have I done wrong? Right?
Okay.
Okay, because they'll feel it. And in a sense, it's quite interesting because sensitive children do this. They walk if they walk into an
Mm.
atmosphere, because they feel it, they will assume it belongs to them. But actually, some people retain that into their adulthood, and it makes them, as I said, absorbent. They're like a
Absorbent.
sponge. They pick up on everything that's going on around them, particularly other people's emotional states. And I think people who have this level of absorbency, it's very, very important that you recognize it and that you learn to develop the life skills you need to work with that. It's a phenomenal it's a phenomenal plus because it makes you a potentially very empathic person. You can get other people on an emotional level. So it can be a fabulous relational skill. But if you become swamped and overloaded by other people's emotions and you don't know how to deal with that, and you're constantly trying to address stuff that doesn't even really belong to you, then that actually can trigger quite high levels of anxiety. So it kind of spirals into other stuff. It feeds what I would call um, the mental verbal diarrhea of self doubt, which I think people
Yes.
with low self esteem often have. You know, they clock into this stuff and their mind runs riot. You know, so we people with low self esteem will often have quite um, quite difficult kind of thinking patterns as their default kind of operational mode. As I said, they tend, and that kind of erodes their confidence. And interestingly enough, it becomes a self fulfilling prophecy because it also continues to erode your self esteem. So people with low self esteem often engage in thinking patterns that maintain low self esteem rather than actually support them in overcoming that and developing that further in a good way. What else have I got on my lovely list? Yes, so absorbent, ultra sensitive thinking patterns, the anticipation, I've mentioned that before, but one of those thinking patterns that comes with anticipation is the what if thinking. You know, what if this happens? What if that happens? And then what if that happens? I should think about what might happen then and what might happen then. And this is very time consuming and it uses the most phenomenal amount of energy. And very often we're thinking about things that are never ever going to happen. You know, so it's really challenging because we also, if we have low self-esteem, we're often those what if thoughts. They're very rarely what if this goes right. It's usually what if this goes wrong. You know, what if I say this? What if I mess up? And so again, it's eroding self-esteem further. It tends to be really draining because it's negative. We get into what I would call insurance policy thinking, where we're trying to combat every possible eventuality. This is the insurance
Yes.
policy part,
Yes.
to make sure we've got it all covered. And there's nothing wrong with future planning, you know, and I will talk about this a little bit later today in terms of some of the strategies that we can use to deal with these things. But if you're really into the big, the what if everything is a catastrophe, you're seriously raising your stress levels as well. So again, that's going to knock your confidence. I mean, if you think about it, when we're feeling anxious and worried, we don't feel confident. We just don't. It's not going to work for us. So all of these things, as I said, become a bit sort of self perpetuating. Um, Low self esteem people have massive inner critics. Again, that self doubt. They really, really give themselves a hard time over everything. That's really, really unhelpful again. And I have a really interesting thing that when I work
Yes.
with people who have a massive inner critic, and again, we'll go into some of the ways that we can tackle this in a moment, um, because they never ever feel good enough. And one of the first things we have to do if we're ever going to change anything is we have to start to notice ourselves. And what I find with people who are like really, really critical of themselves is that when they start to notice themselves being critical, because you have to do that before you can change anything, they then criticize themselves for being critical. You know, but it's just, it's classic. I mean, the great thing is if we can start to see this stuff happening and laugh at ourselves, you know, or laugh with ourselves about it, because that removes us from a place of inner judgment. So I think there's an element of kind of personal humor that is really, really valuable if we can start to kind of bring this into, as I said, we will go into some, techniques about these areas in a short while.
It's that there I go again, isn't it? When you
Yes,
find
it's
yourself
like the, I
going that
know
way.
with me, it's,
Yes.
oh yeah, that old chestnut.
Yes.
Yes, I know that. Hello, self-doubt. Here you are again. Right, let's have a
Mm.
conversation here.
Mm.
So absolutely, we
Mm.
can shift something of our inner dialogue. As I said, we'll kind of move into some real pragmatic tools about all of these different areas. If you have low self-esteem, you might find that some of the things I'm talking about are you. Some of them may not be. You might have one, some, none, or all of them. But I'll carry on with my my list, because if you have low self-esteem, you have a lot of this stuff usually.
What might be good, Jenny, is to invite people, if they have any questions as we go through the list, to
absolutely.
let us have those. They would be great questions, or yes, things they'd like us to particularly focus on.
Yep,
That'd
absolutely.
be great.
Yep, yes. So what I suggest we do is, by all means, send text, type in if you wish. Otherwise, I'll get to the end of the list and we'll pause for a minute. Should we do that, Liv? We'll pause for a minute at that point and then see if anybody wants to give us any feedback, whether they can relate to anything that we're saying. So, following the inner critic, people with low self-esteem never, ever feel good enough. And they never ever feel that anything they do is good enough. And not only that, but they often have massive expectations of perfection of themselves, and they're not very forgiving of themselves. So they might be very kind and very forgiving of others, but relentlessly horrible to themselves in terms of that sort of inner dialogue. They very rarely stop and celebrate their achievements. I think I've said that already, but again, we can meet people who are very outwardly, you would think they had really good self esteem because they're actually very successful. But actually, they're always on to the next goal. They never stop to think, wow, I did that really well. They never credit themselves. They just move on to the next goal, the next target. And it's really quite relentless. We never stop and smell the roses. We never stop and sort of just take time to validate and acknowledge where we are and what we've done. And actually, we're not then giving ourselves one of the core components of self esteem, which is actually validation. I'll come to that in a moment. So you were going to say something.
I was just going to say, often in the commercial environment, very high achievers, when asked what are you good at, can rarely come up with a list of things. Yeah. So they've achieved an enormous amount, but bringing that back to, so what does that mean I have a skill in, or what can I bring that's of value, can be very difficult for them to articulate that.
Yeah, I would agree. And again, also, I noticed that with people in terms of transferable skills, they don't recognize that if they're good at one thing, they will be good at something else. That those relational skills, for example, are really people skills in any environment, and yet people will think, well, I can do that in that bit, but I could never do it in that bit. And so yeah, I think that's comes, and also my next thing on this list is not good at accepting praise. As you said, asking them, what are you good at, and they can't think of anything. And even if you highlight how well they're doing, or if somebody has given them really direct validation, they haven't heard it. It's like, so I was going to say in one ear and out the other. I don't think it even goes in. It's just over their head, just bounces off. And yet, the curious thing is that people with low self-esteem very often continually seek validation from others. They really need it. It's as though they can't stand solidly on their own sense of achievement in whatever area of their life that is, whether that's literally doing a really straightforward everyday task, or just keeping your house clean and tidy and doing everyday stuff that actually takes time and deserves validation, or whether it's a really big something that you're attempting to do that might be a challenge for you. They the need for validation is huge, and that connects back to the people
Yes.
pleasing thing. And it's a real problem because the reality is we are never ever going to get it right for everyone. One of my favorite sayings, when we'll talk more about this, but one of my favorite sayings in kind of bringing myself up, aside from kind of, oh yes, self-doubt, here we go again, is, everyone's a lot of people. When you kind of think, yeah, I want to please everyone. Everyone's a lot of people. So trust me on that. Everyone is a lot of people and you can't. So if we just kind of accept that and work on that as a reality, and maybe, we'll think about how we work on these expectations of perfection and what that does to us. I think that's tremendously important to think about it. And the other really interesting thing about people pleasing, I think this is a really valid example. If you're ever in a group of people, if you're attending something or another, maybe a class or an event, and I always use this as an example. Who do you like most? Do you like the people that appear to get it all right? Or do you like the person who, when you're going around that dreadful round where you have to introduce yourself, if you're in a group and everyone's nervous as hell, and the person that has the courage to say, do you know what? I'm really, really nervous. I find this really difficult. And everyone can actually identify with them. The person you like the most isn't actually the person who appears to be perfect. The person you like the most is the real person, the person who can say, do you know what? I'm not actually okay. This is quite difficult for me. That's the person we identify with. Go and watch any film you watch, any drama. Who do you really love? You don't love the person who's perfect. We love the people in our favorite shows because they're real. We love the people who don't get it right. And yet people with low self-esteem often continually challenge themselves for not getting everything right all the time. And still try to think that they're doing it because they're wanting to please people. So there's a real contradiction in terms going on inside of us. And as I said, I think it's really valuable to be aware of that. And those are just kind of examples. I really like to bring them to mind because when we hold those kinds of things in mind, it starts to shift our perspective on I guess the drivers that are keeping us locked into these patterns of low self-esteem, these thinking patterns. So I think I'm probably nearly at the end of my list, actually, yes, because I've talked about on to the next task and stopping to smell the roses. There's probably a ton of other stuff in reality. This is just what came to mind before the event when I started writing it down. But as I said, I think one of our biggest challenges, there are two challenges that I think are probably the largest actually with low self-esteem. One is that the patterns of behavior, the patterns of thinking, and our kind of perceptions, particularly the beliefs that we have about ourselves and our expectations, tend to reinforce low self-esteem rather than help to build any kind of healthy self-esteem. So I think, that's something that we have to really look at. And the second really big challenge as well is that I think people with low self-esteem, or fundamentally anyway, I think we don't see it. It's something, as we've talked about, high achievers. Lots and lots of people have really low self-esteem or varying degrees of low self-esteem, and no one knows. And the lower your self-esteem is, the less likely you are to step up and ask somebody for help. You're more likely to get involved in trying to attend to it in ways that then actually create more of the same. So those are the two, I think, real challenging areas in relation to self-esteem. So we've got to the end of the list. I think I said we'd pause. So should we pause for a moment, Liv, and just see if anybody wishes to say anything or make any comments or send any texts through about this? I shall pause and have a glass of water for a moment as well while we're doing this. Do you know, Liv, this is a brilliant example because I'm sitting here, you know, when you're kind of waiting for something. So this is great. This is a really good live example of how easily self-doubt can kind of kick in.
Yes.
You know, because you begin to think, well, actually, you know, there's my internal dialogue going. You know, actually, does anybody have anything to say? Or, you know, so it's kind of curious, isn't it? How
It is.
easily, because I would say that these days, I think my self-esteem is quite good. I'm quite easy about, but I suppose this is a really good example, isn't it? Because I'm easy with being able to say that. It's not a problem or a crisis for me to say, actually, gosh, I noticed that going on. You know, which means I can laugh about it.
Yes.
It's back to having a little bit of humour. So I'm just going to glance down at my kind of notes and
Yeah. So we have actually had a text, Jenny, that's come through.
okay.
And it's from someone who says that they are it's a difficult situation with self-esteem and family. So in family situations, this person is finding it very difficult to say no, and even when they do say no, that they try to say no, nobody listens. So they're wondering what you might say around that.
Okay. Isn't it interesting? Because I think I'll kind of respond a little bit to that question. And then I think it kind of takes me to wanting to talk about how we build self-esteem in the first place and where it goes wrong. Okay. And it's the word no that brings me up to this, because no is a boundary. You know, when we say no, we're kind of creating some definition. And one of the biggest causes of low self-esteem, and it's very frequently not a deliberate cause, is that boundaries have been kind of violated, or we've grown up with a lack of boundaries, and so we have a lack of a sense of self or a sense of entitlement around our validness in being able to say no in a way that has an expectation of respect or self-respect around it. Now, so I think, you know, I'll say a little bit about boundaries and just about the fact that our self-esteem is connected to our sense of self and our self-value. So we've spoken about that a little bit earlier. As we grow up, when we're little people, we're born into, effectively, we're born into someone else's picture. You know, we arrive in someone else's world, you know, that the world of our grown-ups. And because our grown-ups aren't just normal people, they're never going to get everything right for us. So sometimes, and it's quite curious with I think I've met quite a few people who have low self-esteem, and actually their parents haven't been challenging or awful or bad parents. In fact, they've been fabulous parents who I would say are so worried about getting it right that they end up almost not creating solid boundaries for that person. So it's kind of a bit like maybe they had a really tough time as a child themselves, and then they kind of overcompensate. So they find it really difficult to say no to their own children. So in turn, then their children grow up without that sort of internalized sense of this is where we stop. A really interesting example that's come to mind where there's somebody I worked who had some really big challenges around food and eating, and she remembered a situation where she'd gone to the cinema and she'd been allowed really to have as many sweets as she wanted, and she'd then subsequently been sick, which was highly embarrassing and highly shameful. But she was afterwards, you know, she when we were talking about it, she said, I just wish that they could have sort of said, no, that's enough. You know, they could have placed a boundary. And she said, actually, you know, my mum was just lovely, and what she knew of her own mum's history was that her mum had come from a family where there was a significant amount of poverty, you know, post-war poverty as well. And she said her mum really bent over backwards to make sure that as a family they all had everything she didn't have. And it's a really interesting example of where you've got a mum who's doing maybe something that isn't so good for all the right reasons. So, but it's curious because it actually created a kind of a lack of a boundary and a lack of safety. You know, I would also say I've come across people who they genuinely are in a family environment where there's never ever been a role model of respecting one another. You know, respect is a boundary, you know, so and actually as much as I would love to think that, you know, predominantly lots of people and the majority of people are good, there are some people who treat others really, really badly, and child abuse does exist. So again, boundaries can be violated. And if our boundaries have been violated, we may struggle with being able to say no because we haven't got a clear role model around that. Our entitlement to being able to say no and have that respected was violated in some way. So it's really interesting. There's a very direct relationship between boundaries and our self-esteem, simply as well because there is a very direct relationship between being somebody having a sense of self and boundaries. You know, that's inherently part of that. So going back to just maybe some pragmatic approaches to this question. Obviously, we don't know the ins and outs of your situation, but I find myself wondering if your family is a family who inherently haven't got a role model where no means no in some way, shape, or form. Now, I think Lib and I probably both got quite a lot of potential kind of different sort of things that you can try out here with this. Now, for starters, I think if I'm around somebody and I think that there's going to be maybe a challenging or a confrontational conversation that's going to be had, I find a very good way of approaching this is always to own how I am feeling. So, for example, I would, rather than saying, look, you're not listening to me, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. That may actually be the case, and that may well be how you feel. But when we go, you are this or you are that, we're pointing the finger. We're saying you're making me feel bad, and I think that's going to get quite a defensive response. So, I think developing a kind of a language. So language is very important here. Developing a language where we can maybe say, right, we know we're going to talk to somebody, we can own it. We can say, look, I've got a problem here with something, and you know, I recognize that I'm feeling quite difficult about this, and I'm wondering if you could help me with this. So we're kind of coming in from a different angle. Okay, so we're asking somebody to give us some support and to engage with us. Now, I'm not saying that that will work every time, but I think it's a really useful kind of approach to any kind of situation where we own the way that we're feeling. You know, how it depends how well you know the person. You know, I mean, you can go much further than that and say, look, actually, I'm finding myself feeling really frustrated, and I'm wondering if I could talk to you about it. You're owning it. You're not saying you are making me feel bad. You're actually owning that. I'm finding myself feeling really frustrated. So I think there's something very important about gauging the level of conversation you can have with somebody, and also rehearsing it. I'm a real believer in actually preparing for something, rehearsing something, having something on the tip of your tongue because it's a sentence or two, or in fact, I think building up a set of stock answers in certain situations is really, really valuable. I've worked with people who've known that they've maybe found somebody quite intimidating at work, and again, you know how you can be put on the spot by someone.
Yes.
You know, now I don't know how anyone listening is about this, but you know, you meet some people sometimes who are really amazing. They can always, you know, they've got the answer just like that. Put on the spot, they know how to come back. You might be like that. I'm not actually. I'm somebody who I always go away, and afterwards, I think, oh, I wish I'd said this, or I wish I'd said that. You know, I will work out afterwards what I wished I could have said. And again, I can use that because actually that's not a bad thing because it means I can reflect after the event. Now, if I'm in a position, let's use me as an example. If I'm standing on a foundation of very low self-esteem, I can come away afterwards, and instead of using that reflective space to benefit myself, I can think, oh, I was so stupid. I got that wrong. If only I could have said this, or if only I could have said that. That all went wrong because of me. My language with myself and my conversation can really, really make me feel about that big. Whereas actually, I know that I'm somebody who benefits from having some reflection. So my capacity to reflect, instead of seeing that as a space for sort of internal criticism, I see it as a space of internal critique. Okay, I really want us to consider as a tool changing your critic into a critique. So then we start to consider that hindsight is genuinely a wonderful thing, rather than a gosh, I'm so stupid, I should have kind of scenario. We can then use that reflective space to think about what we'd like to say and how we might like to say it. So I've slightly digressed, but jumping back to the stock answer, because I know that I am someone who doesn't have those answers just like that. One of my stock answers, for example, if I'm put on the spot, is to say, I'm not really quite sure how to respond to that right now, but I'll take some time, I will think on it, and I will come back to you. I mean, I think we need to develop something that is our own language. But I'm really big on rehearsing this stuff. So ahead of time, you see, ahead of time, I'm not venturing into that what if scenario. It's all going to go wrong. It'll be a catastrophe. Ahead of time, I know myself that I benefit from reflection. So I'm valuing that. Now that builds my self-esteem, because I'm saying, Jenny, I think it's awesome that I can reflect. It's one of my better qualities. And actually, if I remove the critic and I get into the critique, I can begin to use that to my advantage. I can begin to build like a little repertoire. A repertoire. A repertoire. See, and I shall not criticize myself for that. Again, laugh at ourselves. I can build a repertoire. So actually, someone puts me on the spot, I already know I'm going to say, I'm really not sure about that. Or just, I'll think on it and I'll come back to you. Whatever, I just think we can do this for ourselves. And what we're doing is we are creating a boundary. So again, back to boundaries. So if Liv was obviously, I actually know this isn't going to happen because you're just such an awesomely respectful person, and which is why you're just such a wonderful part of my world. But let's say you weren't such a respectful person, and again, that wouldn't necessarily mean that you were intentionally setting out to hurt me, but maybe you're just somebody who lacks boundaries. Maybe you were putting me on the spot because you didn't know any other way of doing something. I could just say, actually, can I pause you for a minute? I don't have the answer right now, but I will go away and think on it and I'll come back to you. I've just said no, but I haven't said no using the word no.
Yes.
And nor have I said, you're really annoying me because you're really getting under my skin and you're pushing my buttons and you're not listening to me. So I haven't got wound up. I haven't started to fuel the emotional fire. I haven't started to get angry. I haven't started to, or even to get angry and suppress the anger because I don't feel entitled to have a voice. The whole thing becomes much more consolidated, much more boundaried. And interestingly enough, what I'm actually demonstrating myself is self-respect. Yeah, I'm allowing myself to know myself. I accept myself. I know that I am someone who benefits from reflection before coming back. I am far more likely to give more to the other person if I have contemplated whatever it is they need to tell me. I could even come back and say, could you say a little bit more about what you need so that I can go away and reflect on this? And then, or we could schedule some time in, or, I'll need a couple of days to think on it. But the real key is I'll come back to you. And if someone was really persistent, I would probably just have to really get a little bit more firm and say, genuinely, I will come back to you, but right now I can't, I need you to respect this because I'm one of those people that needs to think on things, so again, I mean, you can see even as I'm saying it, my hands are up, my body language is working with me here.
Yes,
it's a boundary.
I think it's very interesting. We've also had a comment about when asked to do something, or when anticipating that someone will ask you to do something that you don't want to do, that people can be paralyzed, their mind goes wild, and they can't respond. And I think that's where
Yeah,
rehearsal and preparation
absolutely.
and a language that is yours, which could be a compromise offer, or a I prefer to think about it, or I can't do that, but I can do this. I think that's where the
Absolutely.
practice can be
Yeah,
invaluable.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And going back to low self-esteem, um, validation and acknowledgement, really, really important. The way that we develop self-esteem in the first place is that we are validated. So, as little people, if we're in a world where our parents, our grown-ups, or our family, or the people around us validate us, it develops our sense of entitlement and to be valid, to have a voice. If you grow up in a children are seen and not heard kind of way, or everything that you say is dismissed, or your parents are just, I don't know, struggling themselves, and therefore they're not available to be responsive to you. Um, I think that, especially the lack of responsiveness, the unavailability, generates a massive panic in people. My experience of listening to people who have very low self esteem, and that's kind of ended up developing into anxiety. So, as I said, low self esteem affects different people in different ways. But let's talk about this as it's sort of come up. People with low self esteem, where it has developed into anxiety and what I would call high anxiety thinking patterns, that often comes from a world where there is an absence of responsiveness. So, if you take someone who is fundamentally in personality highly sensitive, highly absorbent, generally speaking, I would say very, very intelligent, so a very good mind, a creative mind, but there is a lack of validation and feedback. There's a lack of relational responsiveness. The absence of something means that highly intelligent, um, that highly sensitive and absorbent child is going to feel all this stuff, take on all this stuff, experience all this stuff, but have nowhere to go with it. There's no acknowledgement of a problem going on. And actually, that highly sensitive and highly creative and highly intelligent mind of that child is going to run riot. Okay, that child is going to, that their wonderfully creative imagination is going to come up with a billion scenarios to try and fix the problem. So that person then starts to develop an extraordinary capacity for creative thought, but the creative thought is tangled up in, if I do this, this might work. If I do that, that might work. And then they act on that. And that's where we begin to see the origins of people pleasing. And because they're actually working with kind of fantasy in a sense, it's all the stuff they imagine they can do, that's not on very solid ground. So the chances are what they do is not going to fix the problem. And the chances are it was never their job to fix the problem in the first place. A really good example actually would be, I had a conversation with someone whose parents had separated, and I think their grown-ups had done what I would call all the wrong things for all the right reasons. This is a real tricky balance to achieve here, because it's never going to be good for parents to expose their children, if they are separating, to the complexities of their relationship and of their relationship breakdown. But if nothing is said and the children pick up on the atmosphere, but they don't know that anything is going wrong, only that they know that something's going wrong, but they don't know what it is, then they're really going to struggle even more. There's a
Yeah.
real fine line between being able to give enough information to offer reassurance. This is nothing to do with you. Mummy and daddy are struggling. We've got our own difficulties, um, which offers the reassurance and the validity of that child's experience. When there's nothing, it really raises anxiety. And once the anxiety kicks in and the things that that child is trying to do to fix stuff inevitably doesn't work because they're carrying something that doesn't belong to them in the first place and it's not their job to fix it. That then raises anxiety because they then feel that they're not getting it right. And I come across this is what I call sort of relational responsiveness. Okay, it's really really key to the building of self-esteem because as we grow up, I'm going to digress and just add something to sort of quantify
Okay.
relational responsiveness. Okay, so if I digress too much, then kind of press a pause
I
button
shall.
for me. I'm just going to differentiate, and particularly because this is Mental Health Awareness Week, right? My this is my definition, but I find again it's a helpful use of language to try. The more language we have around this stuff, the better, because we can make sense of things. So my definition of mental health is our state of mind. Yeah, it's the stuff that goes on in our mind. Emotional health is about the way that we feel. Yeah? So mental health is our state of mind. Emotional health is about the way that we feel, and the two are connected. But there is a really big difference. So if I was to think about, so we all have mental health. It's just that our mental health is never static. Okay. Now that's a really important principle to just kind of get a hold of in a real way. So if I was to draw an imaginary line here, and we've got good mental health at one end, challenging mental health at the other end. So the good mental health means we're probably in quite a positive state of mind. Again, back to our state of mind, we're more likely to have, I don't know, we're more likely to be a glass half full kind of person. If something comes along as a problem, we will perhaps not see it as a problem, but more as an opportunity, something that we can work through. We'll feel confident about that. Challenging mental health and very negative thoughts, often very critical. Really, really, sometimes we just feel like we're wading through treacle, can't see the woods for the trees, overwhelmed by our thinking patterns, often accompanied with high anxiety. Um, if we consider a line again and we think about emotional health, right? And again, we fluctuate on these lines. We are never going to be static because stuff happens in life and that's part of being human. If you are not moving up and down that line, then there's actually something wrong with you. Okay, if you're static and completely fixed, you've tuned out of life completely. So something's going on. Emotional health on that line, it's not about having challenging feelings at one end, and that's poor emotional health, and happy feelings at the other. That is not the case at all. Um, Strong emotional health is about durability. Strong emotional health is like wherever we are on that line, that we feel durable. So we can, the sort of the factor of where we are on that line is to do with our durability and our ability to feel all of our emotions regardless of and be okay. It's like being able to be okay about not being okay. So emotional health is much more about the way that we feel and about being resilient to the way that we feel and being available to experience those emotions without being fazed by them. There's obviously a massive relationship between the two, in terms of our state of mind and our state of emotional health, because if you are not emotionally durable, your emotions will phase you and they will trigger all kinds of challenging thinking patterns, which will often in turn make you feel even worse. Okay. And again, the way we fluctuate, this has real can I say real elements of self-esteem in here, because if your self-esteem is good as a general rule, you will be far more emotionally resilient.
Mm.
So it really, self-esteem underpins something of our mental health as well as our emotional health. So I've digressed a bit. Lib,
You
get me
have,
back
and
to where I was, because there was relevance to it, but I've waffled.
because we were talking about emotional health and self-esteem underpinning emotional health. I think we were trying to give some indications to tools that people can use, Jenny.
Okay.
However, we have only got about 5 minutes of our
Right,
time
wow.
left. So
Do you know, I'm actually stunned that we've got to the end of today, because actually I have literally got a whole list of different things we can do to help, and we haven't actually got in really pragmatic ways to, you know, the list of tools that I actually would really like to share with people. What might be really helpful is, if we really are, I had no idea we were running out of time.
we've got about 5 minutes.
Okay, fine. What would be really helpful is, can people give us some feedback? Because we could actually run our next event, rather than continuing to talk about self-esteem. Literally, you see, my approach to self-esteem is to develop a package of what I would call self-care. You know, like if you go into hospital or you go into a care home, the first thing they will do is they will work out a care package. And one of the best ways that we can tackle any issues of low self-esteem is to look at all the different tools we can use, and there are tons of them. There are so many things I could share with you about this. I mean, we've shared some of them in terms of internal dialogue, but there are loads more.
Many more.
And I wonder whether maybe, if people are up for this and it's helpful, that the next event becomes a kind of a follow-on of this one, and we dive straight into what I would call constructing a package of self-care in relation to building self-esteem, and maybe going through the list of the things that we highlighted that people with low self-esteem have, but tackling them one by one with the tools that you can use to really develop what I would call a bespoke package of self-care for yourself. So I hope that might be of help, and if people could give us feedback as to whether that would be what would work for them, that would be brilliant. We can then actually kind of schedule in the next event. Just back to housekeeping again. If you are not registered on my email list and you want to know when the next event is scheduled, because every link for each event is separate, if you register your email address on jennyflorencehealth.com, we can then actually contact you and let you know that.
Jenny, we have a number of items coming on the live chat from people. Unfortunately, we are 3 minutes away from our finish time today. So it's just to recognise that those items have come in, and perhaps feed them in directly
into
to our
the
next
beginning
session.
of our next session. Certainly, absolutely, we will do that. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I'm actually going to finish with a quote. I like to finish with a quote, and it's very, very relevant. It's particularly in Mental Health Awareness Week. It's a quote by Robin Williams. He said, "Everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind always. And in terms of yourself, be kind to yourself. The key to self-esteem is to develop inner kindness, remove judgment, and, as I said, develop that bespoke package of self-care." So we will dedicate our next event to an entire set, and I guess it's just under an hour's worth of tools that you can actually use. And we'll try and schedule that in relatively soon in the near future.
Yes.
So thank you very, very much indeed for listening, and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.